Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This is Mehdi Kazmi again from Auliya Council of North America and New York. Assalamu alaikum and adab to everybody. Today we are back in our series on Sufism or Tasawwuf with Dr. Rachana Umashankar, who is professor at INO University. Last time we had discussed the concept of love in Sufism. And today we will continue on that theme and then also discuss the concept of haq, or as it is referred to sometimes, the truth, God, reality, and all these terms will be clarified to us by Dr. Umashankar. And let's see what she has to teach us tonight.
Hello, thank you for having me again. So in the last video, which we did, I think we discussed the concept of wahdatul wujud. And right at the end of the video, we started to talk about the connection between Ishq and Haq, between love and truth, love and God. And so I'll try and flesh out that connection a little more clearly this time. So I think a good place to start with this is a very hadith Qudsi that is very prominent in the Sufi tradition. And in this hadith Qudsi, God says that I was a hidden treasure, and I loved to be known. Right? So the word used there is uhibabtu. I loved to be known, and so I created creation, right? So that I may be known. Right? So in the Sufi tradition, this is a very quite an important line. And this hadith Qudsi is especially important because it gives an inkling as to the divine motivation for creation. Right? And in this hadith Qudsi, God is basically saying that a prime motivation for creation was that God wished to be known. Right? God wished to not be alone. Right? God wished to be recognized. And so in some ways one can see how in the Sufi tradition then the greatest way in which one can express love towards the divine is to attempt to know the divine, right? To fulfill God's desire to be known, right? If God desired to be known and therefore created creation, then what greater expression of love towards the divine than fulfilling that desire, right, to be known. And so the desire to know God, right, the irfan, right, the desire to know God, not just in an ilm sense, but in an irfan sense, in a sense not of fact but of truth. That then becomes a central goal, a central ideal of the Sufi path, right? Is how do we know God? How do we know this entity that seems remote, that seems beyond reach? So we can start with that idea of this motivation to know, this desire to know God, because God wishes to be known. And then the question is, okay, how does one know God? How does one come to know God? And there are a couple of ways in which this, question has been, an attempt has been made to answer this question. And one is, and many of the attempts to answer this question really go back to this idea that I discussed in the previous video on Wahdatul Wujud, this idea of immanence, right? The idea, again, to recap really quickly, in Wahdatul Wujud, the idea is that God, as this eternal, infinite being, is both transcendent and immanent. That is, God is both beyond creation and deeply enmeshed in creation. That it is not an either or, it's a false choice. It is both. And one way to understand immanence is to think of the divine traces left in creation. And I think the analogy I gave was of fingerprints left by a potter on a pot. So to recognize the ayat or the athar, the signs and the traces of the divine in the world, and through those traces, like breadcrumbs, to follow those breadcrumbs, to follow those clues to uncover knowledge of God. Right? And if we think of the immanence of God as not so much in, again, directionality is in, we think directionally, so we speak directionally, but that's an issue. But to think of God as, again, enmeshed within creation, and so to think of God as haq, right, as the absolute truth, as the absolute reality, and so therefore all of creation has to exist within that truth, within that reality, therefore within the divine, right? That is, that there is no space beyond the divine, there is no time beyond the divine, there is no creation beyond the divine, and so all of creation exists within that haq, within that reality, within the truth. So if we think of immanence in that way, again, right, the clues to the knowledge of God then can be understood not as something that is far away, not as something that is beyond, but that access to the divine can be found in creation itself. Right?
In the here and now.
Yes, the here and now, in our reality. Right? That is, the quest for knowledge of God is a quest inward. It is a quest homeward, rather than a journey of moving away. It is a quest of forever coming closer and closer and closer to the within. A very important line in the Quran is when God says that, you know, he is closer to the human being than the jugular vein, right? And again, there too, in the Quran, in that verse, the implication is that God is not to be seen as remote, but as incredibly close. And so the question then is not to seek out something that is far away or separate, but to find the capacity to recognize something that is right here, but that we are not seeing for some reason, that we're not recognizing for some reason. So both of these ideas, the idea, first, the imperative to know God. Why should one know God, right? And Sufis have often pointed to this Qudsi, right? This idea that God desires to be known, and therefore we must know God. And God as a hidden treasure, right? As something that, as an entity that needs to be uncovered, discovered in a way. And then with the idea of immanence, right? With the idea of the divine enmeshed in creation, right? As well as transcendent, but in this case, the idea of immanence is important. Then the next step is, okay, how does one know God? The journey towards God then has to be a journey of, as I said, being able to recognize God in reality, right? To not be to be able to see what is right in front of you, but are not able to recognize it, right? So it is that, and so what Sufism really, the Sufi journey, is a journey of a shift of perspective, right? It's a perspectival shift that is required of the seeker, right? To change one's vantage points so that one is able to see what is already there, right? So that what is covert becomes apparent, right? The 𝐏𝐫𝐸𝐻𝐿 𝐐mehjoob, right? The unveiling of that which is veiled, right? And the unveiling there, it's almost a misnomer where we say 𝐏𝐫𝐸𝐻𝐿 �mehjoob is the unveiling of the veiled. What is being unveiled there? It's not the divine. It is our
your own veil being taken off.
perspective, right? So that is the unveiling. Is that capacity to recognize the divine in reality, to recognize the divine as Haq, right? Haq as Haq, God as truth. And so then the next question is, okay, then how does one do that, right? How does one journey closer rather than far away to find the divine? And then that's where love again comes into our conversation, right? Because as I mentioned with our discussion of love, of Ishq, in the Sufi tradition, it is seen as a force that has the capacity to diminish the ego barrier, and the ego barrier is that veil. The ego barrier is blindfold that prevents us from recognizing the divine as truth. And so cultivating that unquestioning love towards the divine diminishes the ego, hopefully collapses the ego. And in that collapsing of the ego, our perspective is unveiled, our perspective is shifted, right? Our vision is unveiled, unblinkered. And then we are able to see God as truth. We are able to know God, right? So those are sort of some of the steps between the idea of Haq, right? How the idea of Haq and Ishq are connected is that the path identified within the Sufi tradition for knowing God as truth, that path is the path that begins with love, ends with love. So that, I hope that clarifies that connection.
Yes.
To
So love as the path to Haq or truth. To simplify it, that love as a path to the divine or the truth.
Yes, love as a path to the divine / truth, right? Haq being both. And also love as a motivation for it as well, because God wanted to be known. Right. So love is a driving force at multiple levels there. Love is the impetus, right? The love for God requires the lover to fulfill the desires of God. And if God desires to be known, then you know God, right? You seek to know God. So love is the motivation. Love is the avenue, right? To the diminishment or the annihilation of the ego, and then knowledge of God itself as the experience of love from the divine. Right? To know God is to then also be fully aware of the love of God towards creation. So love is both the bookends, the start, the finish, and the journey. Right? Within the Sufi tradition, it's all those stages are inseparable from the idea of love.
So could you tell us how the seeking of haq is put into practice, particularly in the Chishti Sufi tradition. Could you throw some light on that?
Sure. And we've touched on this before when we talked about wedge, where in the in Sufism, in the Chishtiya Sufism, of course, but in all forms of Sufism, there are two primary modes of meditative practice, which is the zikr and the sama, and they're mirror images, flip sides of the same coin. Zikr is remembrance of God. Some traditions and Naqshbandiyas do their zikr silently, but for the most part, zikr practices around the world are vocal. It involves chanting, it involves recitation, it involves music, rhythmic drumming, different cultural takes on zikr, right? So, and zikr involves usually remembrance of God, remembrance of the prophets, remembrance of some other important sacred figures in the Islamic tradition, and often the repeated chanting of phrases like Allahu, the repeated chanting of the Shahada. And so the contemplation and chanting of the names of God, the attributes of God, these are some forms of zikr. And sama, so in zikr, the practitioner is actively, the way I tell my students is, in zikr, the practitioners are usually the ones who are chanting. They're the ones who are singing, or they're making invocations, they're vocalizing in some way usually. In sama, the practitioner is not vocalizing. The word sama means to listen. And so in the sama ritual, the practitioner is listening to sounds, whether that's chanting, whether that's poetry recitation, whether that's music, what have you, is listening to those sounds and using the sound as an avenue for focus on the divine. So both zikr and sama are very important forms of meditative practice in Sufi traditions. In the Chishtiya tradition, of course, uniquely, sama has taken on the form of the qawwali, which is the central,
Right.
The core of the sama ritual is singing of qawwali. And it is an invitation. The qawwali is an invitation for those listening to use the sounds of ecstatic love and joy and desire for union with the beloved, to use those to feel a mirrored sense of love and desire for God. So your question was the use of these traditions to know God. Was that the question?
Yes, or to experience that haqiqat.
Yeah, and it is, I think, that sort of brings it back full circle in that, going back to the video on Wajd, in that video, I mentioned that Wajd is a temporary experience of a feeling of oneness with God, where in that moment one's ego is diminished to such a great extent that one has a glimpse of union with God. One has a glimpse of God as truth, right? Where all other sensations, all other worries, all other anxieties, all other bonds that sort of weight you down disappear, and your only abiding sensation is a sense of bliss and peace within the embrace of the divine. And that is the temporary experience of Wajd. That is what is and the word Wajd means ecstasy, spiritual bliss. And so that is the experience of Wajd. And so all of these rituals are geared towards that diminishment of the ego so that then God can be experienced as Haqq, right? As the only truth. And again, sort of going back to that idea of bliss, of peace, of a feeling of calm. I think in one of the videos I mentioned this idea of God as Rahman and Rahim, and the root of those two words being Rahm or womb. And the implication, of course, there being that the compassion and the love of God is like the compassion and love of God is likened to a womb-like sense of security, right? And the womb has this all-encompassing space for the entity within the womb that is the reality, that is the Haqq. And so it is that experience, right, to feel that sense of complete assuredness in the love of the divine, and that is only seen as occurring when you are able to perceive God as Haqq, right? As there being nothing else except God, right? God as the ultimate truth, God as the ultimate reality. So that that also sort of brings me to, if I may,
please
bring in that very famous story of Mansur al-Hallaj, if I could bring that up. Because he talks about Haqq, and it ties very well into our discussion of Wahdatul Wujud from the previous video. So for those who are unfamiliar, Mansur al-Hallaj is a very, very important figure in the Sufi tradition. And to put it very briefly, he experiences this sort of ecstatic moment. And in that ecstatic moment, Wajd, he declares in Arabic, he says, Ana al-Haqq, right? Which translates literally to, I am God, or I am the truth.
I am truth.
Yeah. I am truth, or I am God, either way, however you translate Haqq. And of course, that's shirk, right? That is drawing an equivalence to the divine, sort of a profound act of sacrilege. And so for that ecstatic declaration, right, Hallaj is executed. Right? He is executed as a blasphemer. And so it's worth sort of pausing to consider the Sufi interpretation of Hallaj's declaration an al-Haqq. So the in saying, so this is the Sufi understanding, right? And there are other Sufi interpretations, but I think the one that links best to Wahdatul Wujud is that in that moment of Wajd, in that ecstatic moment, Hallaj had annihilated his ego in that moment. So when he says, when the words come out of Hallaj's mouth, Ana al-Haqq, it is not Hallaj speaking, because there is no Hallaj in that moment. Hallaj has been annihilated. There is no ego, there is no self, there is no Mansur al-Hallaj anymore. So when he's saying Ana al-Haqq, it is God speaking. It is God is the Ana there. God is declaring his position as truth. Right? God is declaring
only presence. Yeah.
Right? Ana al-Haqq. Right? I am the truth. So it is not Hallaj speaking. Because there is no Hallaj at that point. His ego is completely diminished. And so, in a way, from that perspective, right, from that reading of this event, um, the declaration of Ana al-Haq
Mhm.
expressed through Halaj is the pinnacle of Tawheed. It's
Right.
not shirk, right? It is the ultimate Tawheed, because in that moment there is only God
Correct.
for Halaj. There is no Halaj anymore. Even he is
The
not.
annihilation of all selves and disappearance of all selves, and the only reality that remains is Haq, God.
So what else?
Right.
Once the ego is annihilated, what else is there left to say? There is nothing one can say. Only the divine can say. And what does the divine say? The divine says, "I am truth." So that is the Sufi interpretation of the Ana al-Haq declaration, and that ties to this idea of God being sort of enmeshed in creation, right? God being transcendent as well as immanent, and uh, immanently accessible. So much so that when the ego is annihilated, then God is perceived. So that, and of course, then Halaj's declaration as the ultimate, him having achieved that desire to know God, right? Have fulfilled God's desire to be known, right? So intimately that there is no halaj to be known anymore. There is only haq. There is only truth.
Well, thank you so much, Ratna. That really clarifies two pillars of tasawwuf, and that'll take us on to further topics. Let's do more topics next week, and perhaps at the same time. Thank you again for giving so much of your thoughts and time. Thank you, viewers, for watching us. Kindly like us and share us, and press that bell icon so that we can do more programs like this. We exist. This channel exists for the education and satisfaction of our viewers, and we would love your feedback. Thank you so much. Khuda Hafiz.
Thank you very much. Khuda Hafiz.